History Zone, where the past comes alive. History hides the truth.
I arrived in Chicago in the spring of 1893, when the city smelled like coal smoke, wet wood, and ambition. Every street hummed with promise. The world's Columbian Exposition was coming, and America wanted to show the world it had survived its youth and grown into something powerful. So did I, or at least that's what I told myself. I was a survivor by necessity. My father had died young, my mother followed soon after, and the East offered little except memories I was trying to outrun. Chicago felt different, loud, sharp, alive. If a man disappeared here, the city barely noticed. I didn't know then how true that would become. I found work through a small newspaper advertisement. Drugstore assistant needed. Respectable wages. Inquire within. The address led me to Englewood, just south of the city center. That was where I first saw the building. It didn't look evil. That's the truth most people don't like hearing. It was tall, 3 stories of brick, solid, well kept, standing confidently at the corner like it belonged there. A pharmacy on the ground floor, rooms above. Ordinary, safe, American. And then I met the man. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, though he told me to call him H.H. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately dressed. His mustache was neatly trimmed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. When he smiled with his whole face, the kind of smile that made you trust him before he ever said a word. Chicago is full of opportunity, he told me as he shook my hand. His grip was firm, practiced, but only for men willing to work hard. I believed him. Holmes owned the pharmacy and, as I later learned, the building itself. He spoke with confidence, the kind that soothed nerves and commanded rooms without effort. Patients trusted him, women admired him, men envied him quietly. He seemed like the embodiment of the American dream, educated, successful, self-made. He offered me a room upstairs with the job, cheap rent, convenient hours, a chance to save money. I didn't hesitate. That decision would follow me for the rest of my life. The first night I slept in that building, I noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful, quiet in a way that pressed against your ears. The walls felt thicker than they needed to be. The hallways twisted oddly, turning when I expected them to run straight. Doors peered where doors shouldn't have been. Others opened to nothing but brick. Old construction, Holmes explained when I asked. Constant renovations, hard to keep track. He laughed lightly. I laughed too. During the day, the pharmacy bustled with customers, especially women traveling into the city for the World's Fair. Holmes hired them often. Young women, widows, girls alone in a new city. He paid well. Then, sometimes, they vanished. At home sick, Holmes would say. Found better work, he'd shrug. Went back east. Chicago swallowed explanations easily. At night, strange sounds drifted through the building. Metal scraping metal, a muffled thud. Once I heard what sounded like a door slamming shut, followed by silence so deep it made my chest ache. I told myself it was pipes, or boilers, or my imagination feeding on the city's stories. Chicago was full of rumors, gangs, corruption, death by accident or misfortune. Nothing personal, nothing intentional. But Holmes was always awake. No matter the hour, a lamp burned in his office. I would see his silhouette pass beneath the frosted glass, slow and deliberate, like a man walking a route he knew by heart. Sometimes when I passed him in the hallway late at night, he would smile and ask if I was sleeping well. Like a stone, I lied.
One evening, he invited me into his office. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and spoke about life, about how easily people trusted appearances. He told me survival wasn't about strength, it was about control. People are predictable, he said calmly. They go where you guide them. I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. Holmes didn't laugh back. That night, I dreamed of corridors closing in on themselves, of doors locking without keys, of breathing growing shallow in the dark. I woke drenched in sweat, convinced I had heard footsteps outside my door. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. No sound, no light, only the building, waiting, and somewhere inside it, a man with a kindly smile who knew exactly where every wall led and where every person disappeared.
By the second week, I realized the building was learning me. That sounds foolish, I know. Buildings don't learn, they don't watch. But every step I took inside that place felt recorded, remembered. The floors creaked only in certain spots. The air changed temperature from room to room. Even blindfolded, I could tell when I crossed from one hallway into another. The structure had patterns, patterns only one man fully understood. Holmes. He called the upper floors the hotel, though no sign outside announced it. Guests came quietly, mostly women, often alone, sometimes with luggage that was never seen again. Holmes handled their check-ins personally. No registry, no questions, just a warm smile and a room key that never seemed to match any other. I helped carry bags sometimes. That was how I learned something was wrong. The rooms upstairs were nothing alike. Some had windows, some didn't. Some doors locked from the outside. Others had no visible keyholes at all. One room had 3 doors, none of which led where you expected. Another sloped downward so slightly you didn't notice until your stomach turned. Efficient use of space, Holmes explained when I stared too long. Modern design. One afternoon, I watched him guide a young woman up the stairs. She wore a blue traveling dress and carried herself like someone pretending not to be afraid. As they passed me, she smiled politely. I never saw her again. That night, the building spoke louder than usual. I lay awake, listening as pipes hissed, and something heavy shifted above me. Then came a sound I couldn't explain, a dull, rhythmic thump. Not mechanical, not accidental. It had weight, purpose, like something striking flesh and stopping only when it was tired. I held my breath until my lungs burned. In the morning, Holmes was already in the pharmacy, cheerful as ever. He hummed while arranging bottles, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. Not a drop of sweat, not a trace of fatigue. "You look pale," he said pleasantly. "Bad dreams?" I nodded. He smiled wider. That afternoon, Holmes asked me to help with renovations. He handed me a wrench and directed me toward a room at the end of the second floor. The door opened into darkness, no windows, no furniture, just a metal plate embedded in the floor, bolted down tight. "Gas line access," he said. I knelt to inspect it and smelled something sharp, chemical. I looked up to ask a question, and the door closed behind me. The click of the lock echoed louder than any scream. My heart slammed against my ribs as I rushed the door. It wouldn't budge, no handle on the inside, only smooth wood and iron. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it resisted my breath. Then I heard his voice, calm, curious, through the wall. "Just a test," Holmes said. "Stand still." I pounded until my hands went numb. Panic clawed at my throat as a faint hissing filled the room. The smell grew stronger. My head swam. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The door opened. Holmes stood there, watching me sway on my feet. "Apologies," he said lightly. "Wrong valve." I staggered past him, fury and terror twisting together inside my chest.
He watched me go, eyes sharp now, calculating. From that moment on, I paid attention. I noticed how chutes hid behind wardrobes, how certain hallways led downward, though we were already on the top floor, how Holmes carried multiple keys but never fumbled for the right one. I noticed the faint stains that never quite washed out of the floorboards, and I noticed the smells. Burnt hair, acid, something sweet and rotten beneath it all. One night, curiosity overpowered fear. I followed Holmes quietly as he moved through the building with a lantern. He stopped before a door I had never seen open. He unlocked it and stepped inside. I waited, then followed. The room beyond wasn't a room at all. It was a chamber, metal table, chains bolted into the walls, a slanted floor with a drain at its center. No windows, no mercy. I backed away too fast. The floor creaked. Holmes turned. Our eyes met in the lantern light, and for the first time, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You weren't meant to see that," he said softly. In that moment, I understood the truth. This building wasn't a hotel. It wasn't a home. It was a machine, and Holmes was its engineer. I returned to my room shaking, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. If I stayed too long, I would not leave alive.
After that night, I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the floor sounded like a signal meant for me. Every footstep in the hallway felt deliberate. I learned to lie still, breathing shallow, listening for the soft jingle of keys that meant Holmes was on the move. When I heard it, I counted my breaths and prayed he passed my door. The women kept coming. Chicago was overflowing with them. Clerks, secretaries, widows, travelers drawn by the World's Fair. Holmes welcomed them with practiced charm. He offered work, he offered rooms, he offered safety in a city that devoured the unprepared. They trusted him. I watched one woman in particular, a red-haired typist named Julia, laugh with Holmes behind the pharmacy counter. She had sharp eyes and a tired smile, the look of someone who had already survived too much. Holmes treated her differently. He lingered near her, lowered his voice, promised stability. I tried to warn her. "Be careful," I said one afternoon as she counted receipts. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "This place, it isn't right." She smiled sadly. "None of us are in the right place, are we?" She vanished 3 weeks later. Holmes told me she'd left town with a man, paid her wages in advance, said she was grateful. He spoke as though reading from a script he'd rehearsed 100 times. But I found her hairpin near the stairs, bent, broken. By then I knew better than to ask questions. The building seemed to breathe differently when someone was trapped inside it. The air grew stale, sounds traveled strangely, laughter drifting down from empty rooms, footsteps echoing where no one walked. Once I heard singing, a woman's voice, soft at first, then desperate. It stopped abruptly. Holmes hired constantly, fired constantly, paid in cash, no records, no witnesses. He once told me that paperwork was a liability. "Survival favors the unseen," he said casually, measuring chemicals into a glass beaker. One evening I followed the smell. It led me to the basement. I had avoided that place since the day I arrived. Holmes said it was storage, a furnace room, nothing more. But the odor, burnt flesh mixed with acid, pulled me downward like a hook in my gut. The stairs creaked under my weight. At the bottom, the light from my lantern revealed a sight I still see when I close my eyes. A kiln, large enough to swallow a body whole. Beside it, barrels labeled with chemical symbols I barely recognized, a work table stained dark and sticky, and bones, small, clean, unmistakably human, stacked neatly in a crate. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the lantern. I heard footsteps above me. I hid.
Holmes entered the basement humming, carrying a sack over his shoulder. Something inside it shifted. He set it down gently, almost tenderly, like a man placing a child into bed. I watched from behind a coal pile as he worked with calm efficiency. There was no rage in him, no frenzy, just focus, precision. That terrified me more than anything else. When he left, I ran, not from the building, but back to my room, where fear rooted me in place. I realized then that Holmes didn't just kill people, he erased them. No bodies meant no crime. No missing persons reports meant no search. The World Fair brought millions through Chicago. Who would notice a few dozen never leaving? Survival in that building meant invisibility. I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I stopped making eye contact. I learned which corridors Holmes used most often and avoided them. I learned which rooms were safe, not because they were kind, but because they were unfinished. But Holmes noticed everything. One night he called me into his office. The door closed softly behind me. "I feel you've become distant," he said, folding his hands on the desk. His tone was almost hurt. "Have I done something to offend you?" My mouth went dry. I forced myself to speak. "No, sir." He studied me for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the door behind his desk, the one I had seen lead to the chamber. He rested his hand on the knob. "Trust," he said, "is the most fragile thing in the world." He turned back to me and smiled. "Be careful not to lose mine." That was the night I decided I would escape or die trying, because I finally understood the truth no one else could see. The women weren't leaving. They were being reduced to smoke, to bone, to nothing. And I was living inside the proof.
From the moment Holmes warned me about trust, I felt it. Not fear, attention. The building no longer ignored me. Doors that once stood ajar were now closed. Hallways I used daily became dead ends. Holmes began assigning me tasks at odd hours, sending me to rooms I'd never entered before. Always alone, always at night. He was testing me. Survival, I realized, wasn't about escape yet. It was about proving I wasn't worth the effort. I slowed my movements, lowered my eyes, became dull on purpose. I answered questions with shrugs and apologies. I let him believe I was frightened but obedient, broken just enough to be harmless. But Holmes was patient. One night, he handed me a note with an address written in precise handwriting. "Deliver this," he said, "and return immediately." The address led nowhere, an empty lot swallowed by fog. I stood there long enough to understand the message. He was checking if I'd run. When I returned, Holmes was waiting. He looked relieved. "Good," he said. "I hate uncertainty." That was when I knew my time was nearly over. The women had stopped coming. The fair was ending. The crowds were thinning. Holmes didn't need the building to be busy anymore. He needed it to be quiet. The first attempt came disguised as kindness. Holmes invited me to dinner, a rare thing. He cooked himself, humming softly as he prepared the meal. I noticed he didn't eat from my plate, didn't touch his glass. I pretended not to notice. When dizziness crept into my limbs, I stood too quickly and let the chair fall. The movement startled him. His eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected resistance. "I think I'm ill," I muttered, forcing myself toward the door. He watched me go, expression unreadable. That night, I locked myself in my room and stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand. The second attempt was more direct. I returned from the pharmacy to find my room changed, furniture shifted, the bed closer to the wall, a new vent cut into the floorboards. I didn't sleep there again. I began hiding my belongings in the stairwell, sleeping in unfinished rooms, eating only food I prepared myself.
I mapped the building in my head, every turn, every drop, every place a man could vanish. Holmes grew colder. He spoke less, watched more. One evening, as I descended the stairs, I heard a scream rip through the building. It was close. Instinct took over. I ran toward the sound and found a young woman clawing at a locked door, her fingers bleeding. Her eyes met mine, wild, pleading. I didn't think. I grabbed her arm and pulled. The door burst open into a narrow passage I hadn't seen before. We ran blindly, footsteps pounding behind us. Holmes shouted something, my name. That was the moment I became a liability. We reached a dead end. A chute opened beneath our feet. I shoved her aside just as the floor gave way. She screamed as she fell. The sound ended far below. I stood frozen, staring into darkness. Holmes emerged from the shadows, breathing hard. For the first time, his composure was cracked. "You interfere," he said quietly. I raised my hands. I slipped. He studied me, then nodded slowly. "Be more careful." That night, I packed everything I owned into a single sack. I didn't know when I would run, only that when I did, I could not fail. Because Holmes had stopped smiling at me. And when he stopped smiling at you, it meant the building had already chosen where you would disappear.
Once you decide to escape a place like that, the fear changes. It stops being loud and frantic. It becomes cold, focused. Every sound sharpens, every second stretches. You don't think about freedom, you think about timing. One mistake, one wrong turn, and the building swallows you whole. I waited 3 nights. I watched Holmes's routines the way a hunter studies prey. When he ate, when he slept, if he slept at all, which keys he carried on which days. I noticed he favored his right hand and that he always paused at the top of the stairs, listening before descending. On the 4th night, the city outside went quiet under a heavy rain. Rain was good. It covered sound. It erased footprints. I moved. I kept to the unfinished 3rd floor, barefoot, sack slung over my shoulder. I avoided the main stairwell and took the servants' stairs instead, the ones Holmes rarely used because they were inefficient. Halfway down, I heard the keys. The faint jingle echoed like a gunshot in my skull. I froze, pressing myself into the shadow of a half-built wall. Holmes's lantern light crept along the stairs, stretching his silhouette into something inhuman. He paused, just like I knew he would, listening. I counted my breaths. After a moment, the light moved away. I reached the 2nd floor and turned into a corridor I thought I knew. It wasn't. The hallway sloped downward, pulling me forward. Doors lined the walls, all identical, all wrong. Panic surged as I realized the building had shifted, or maybe I had finally misunderstood it. I chose a door at random. Inside, darkness and the faint smell of iron. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun, heart pounding, hands searching for a handle that wasn't there. The floor beneath my feet vibrated slightly. A soft hiss began. No. I dropped to the floor, crawling blindly until my fingers found a seam in the wall. I pried, scratched, ripped my nails bloody until the panel gave way. Cold air rushed in. I squeezed through into a narrow passage barely wide enough to breathe. The hiss grew louder behind me. I crawled forward as the air burned my lungs. The passage ended in a ladder. I climbed. At the top, a trapdoor opened into the pharmacy. Freedom was 5 steps away. That's when Holmes spoke. Leaving without saying goodbye? He stood in the doorway, rain-soaked coat gleaming, pistol in hand. His face was calm, almost disappointed. "You could have stayed," he said. "You were useful." I raised my hand slowly. The sack slipped from my shoulder and hit the floor, spilling everything I owned. "I won't tell anyone," I said.
The lie tasted bitter. Holmes sighed. "That's what they all say." He raised the pistol. A crash of thunder shook the building, and in that instant, the lights flickered. I lunged. The gun fired. Pain exploded across my shoulder as I slammed into him. We fell hard. The pistol skidded across the floor. Holmes moved fast, faster than I expected, but desperation gave me strength. I grabbed a bottle from the counter and smashed it against his face. He screamed, not in pain, but in rage. I ran. I burst into the street as rain poured down, vanishing into the city that had once welcomed me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until dawn. I went to the police. They didn't believe me. A respected doctor, a successful businessman, a hotel owner during the World's Fair? They laughed. So I disappeared. I left Chicago under a false name, carrying a wound that never healed right and memories that followed me everywhere. Years later, when the papers finally told the truth, when bodies were found and Holmes stood trial, I understood something I hadn't then. I survived because I learned his rules, because I moved when the building least expected it, and because sometimes even monsters underestimate the will to live.
I thought escape would end the story. I was wrong. You don't outrun something like Holmes. You just widen the distance enough to breathe. For years, I lived under borrowed names, worked jobs that didn't ask questions, slept lightly and never stayed anywhere long. Every time I heard keys jingle, my chest tightened. Every unfamiliar hallway felt like a trap. Then, in the winter of 1894, I saw his name in print. Not for murder, for fraud. Insurance fraud, to be exact. The papers said Holmes had been arrested in Boston for swindling companies out of thousands using false identities and staged deaths. The irony burned. Dozens, maybe hundreds, had vanished into his walls, and the law finally caught him because he'd tried to steal from corporations. Greed had done what bodies could not. I followed the trial coverage obsessively. Each article felt like proof that my survival hadn't been a fever dream. Witnesses described the man I knew, the charm, the lies, the endless aliases. They called him intelligent, calculating, a master of deception. None of them used the word evil. Chicago authorities began searching the Englewood building. Reporters called it a castle because no other word fit. When the doors were finally forced open, the truth spilled out. Rooms sealed from the inside, chutes hidden behind wardrobes, staircases leading nowhere, gas lines feeding into bedrooms, the basement kiln, the acid vats. The city recoiled. I read every detail, my hands shaking, remembering each space as if I still stood inside it. The police found bones, human remains stripped clean, children's bones, women's bones, lives reduced to evidence. Holmes confessed to some of it, then recanted, then confessed again. The numbers changed every time he spoke. 27 victims, he claimed at one point. The press suspected more. No one would ever know the true count. That uncertainty was his final cruelty. I was called to testify. I almost didn't go. But survival isn't just escaping, it's standing when the past finally turns to face you. The courtroom smelled like ink and sweat. Holmes sat calmly, dressed as neatly as ever. When his eyes met mine, he nodded politely, as if we were old colleagues. I told the jury about the rooms, the gas, the screams, the woman who fell into the chute. My voice didn't shake, not because I was brave, but because I'd already told the story 1,000 times in my head. Holmes listened with interest. When it was his turn to speak, he denied knowing me. An unfortunate imagination, he said mildly. The jury convicted him anyway. In 1896, Holmes was sentenced to hang. On the day of the execution, I stood among the crowd outside the prison. The air buzzed with anticipation,
not relief. America wanted a monster to look like one. Holmes didn't oblige. He walked to the gallows with steady steps. He showed no fear, no remorse. He requested his body be buried in concrete so grave robbers couldn't steal it. Even in death, he wanted control. When the trap door opened, his neck didn't break. He strangled slowly. 15 minutes passed before the doctor pronounced him dead. Some said he deserved it. I didn't stay to hear the cheers. Survival doesn't end when the monster dies. It ends when you stop living in his shadow. I left the crowd and walked alone, knowing the building was gone, the man was dead, and the truth finally was known. But some nights I still dream of hallways that move, of doors without handles, of a kindly smile waiting at the end. America's first serial killer didn't just murder people. He built a place where survival itself became a test. And somehow, I passed.
Trials are supposed to bring clarity. This one brought noise. By the time Holmes was transferred back to Chicago, the city had already decided what he was: a monster, a curiosity, a headline. People lined up outside the courthouse as if waiting for a show. Vendors sold papers with his face printed large, his eyes calm and unreadable. Children pointed, women whispered, men argued numbers as if body counts were wagers. Inside, the truth fractured. Holmes changed his story every time he opened his mouth. One day he admitted to murder, the next he claimed innocence. Sometimes he blamed accomplices who didn't exist. Other times he spoke as though death simply happened around him, accidental and unavoidable. The prosecutors struggled. Without bodies, murder was hard to prove. Acid and fire had erased too much. Bones could not speak names. Families had no graves to point to, no certainty to stand on. Holmes knew this. He sat through testimony with polite interest, correcting small details, smiling faintly when witnesses contradicted one another. He treated the courtroom like another room in his building, one more place where confusion worked in his favor. When I testified again, he watched closely. I described the architecture, the deliberate design, how the rooms weren't random, but purposeful, how the building itself was part of the crime. The defense scoffed. A fanciful imagination, they said, a frightened man seeing patterns where none exist. Holmes leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Then the evidence came. Insurance documents, forged names, policies taken out on people who disappeared shortly after. Holmes hadn't killed only for pleasure, he'd killed for profit. He had married women, named himself beneficiary, and erased them when the ink dried. Greed again. The jury listened differently after that. For the first time, Holmes looked uneasy, not afraid, but irritated. His system was unraveling. The lies were stacking too high. During a recess, I found myself standing near him in the corridor, guards between us. He turned his head slightly. "You lived because you were cautious," he said quietly. "Most people aren't." I didn't answer. "Survival," he continued almost thoughtfully, "is a matter of attention." Then he smiled, and the guards moved him away. That smile followed me home. The verdict came swiftly after that. Guilty. Not for all the murders. America would never have proof of those, but enough. Enough to ensure he would never walk free again. Still, Holmes wanted the final word. He sold his confession to a newspaper for money. In it, he claimed to have killed 27 people. Then, in the same breath, he claimed he was innocent of everything. He wrote with theatrical flair, crafting his own legend. America read every word. That was his last trick, turning horror into entertainment. On the night before his execution, I couldn't sleep. I realized something then that chilled me more than any locked room. Holmes didn't fear death. He feared being forgotten.
The trial wasn't about justice to him. It was about permanence, ensuring that even after the rope tightened, his name would remain. When dawn came, I understood that survival meant more than escaping walls and gas and darkness. It meant refusing to let him own the story. So I tell it now, not as he wanted it told, but as it was lived, by those who didn't vanish.
They moved Holmes to Philadelphia to await execution. I learned this from a brief notice buried deep in the paper. No headlines this time. The spectacle was fading. America had new distractions, new scandals, new tragedies. Holmes had become old news. That pleased him, I think. Death row is a quiet place, not silent, but subdued. Sounds carry differently when nothing is meant to happen anymore. I visited once, standing in a narrow corridor outside his cell, the air heavy with damp stone and resignation. He looked rested. His hair was neatly combed, his suit pressed. He greeted me as though I were a guest. "Still alive," he said. "Good." I asked him why, not why he killed, but why he designed it, the building, the systems, the cruelty refined into architecture. Holmes considered the question seriously. "People think violence is loud," he said. "It isn't. It's procedural. You remove uncertainty, and the rest follows." He spoke like an engineer explaining a bridge. I asked if he felt remorse. He smiled faintly. Remorse implies error. I left shaking. In the days that followed, Holmes wrote constantly. Letters, confessions, retractions. He claimed at one point that he was possessed by the devil, that he could feel evil crawling in his bones. Doctors examined him and declared him sane, perfectly sane. That frightened the public more than madness ever could. The night before his execution, Holmes slept soundly. Guards said he snored. At dawn, I stood outside the prison walls with a small crowd. No cheers this time, just quiet anticipation. Even the sky seemed hesitant, clouded and pale. Holmes walked to the gallows without resistance. He looked older, but no weaker. When asked if he had final words, he spoke calmly, complaining only that the rope was uncomfortable. The trapdoor opened, he fell, and still he lived. Minutes passed. His chest rose and fell in shallow spasms. His face darkened. Some in the crowd turned away. Others stared, unable to look anywhere else. 15 minutes. That's how long it took for him to die. Later, a doctor noted something strange. Holmes's neck had not broken. His heart had fought until the end. Survival instinct, even then. They buried him beneath concrete, just as he requested. No grave marker, no place to gather, no shrine. He had controlled every detail of his life. He wanted to control his death. Years have passed since then. Chicago rebuilt. The building was torn down, its bricks scattered, its shape erased from the skyline. People walk that street now without knowing what once stood there. Sometimes I wonder if that's the greatest mercy. Holmes believed survival belonged to the clever, but he was wrong. Survival belongs to those who remember. When Holmes was finally dead, people expected relief. What they got instead was discomfort. The papers tried to tidy the story, to package it neatly. America's first serial killer executed. They printed sketches of his face, diagrams of the building, timelines that pretended order had always been waiting just beneath the chaos. But there was no neat ending. Families came forward long after the trial ended, mothers clutching faded photographs, sisters with letters that were never answered, husbands who had waited years before accepting that waiting was all they would ever do. No bodies meant no funerals, and without funerals, grief had nowhere to go. I returned to Chicago once, years later. The neighborhood looked ordinary. Children playing, shops opening their doors, streetcars clattering past. The castle was gone. In its place stood something forgettable. I stood across the street and felt nothing at first, then everything. Memory has weight. It presses into you when you least expect it. I remembered the slope of the hallways, the way the air thickened in certain rooms, the silence after a scream ends. I walked away before anyone noticed me standing too long. America argued over numbers. Was it 27? 50? More? Historians debated, reporters speculated. Holmes had succeeded in one final way. He left confusion behind him like fog. That was part of his design. But the truth isn't in numbers, it's in patterns. Young women traveling alone, workers paid in cash, insurance policies filed under false names, a building designed to erase witnesses, a man who understood that survival favors those who control the environment. I carried that understanding with me into the rest of my life. I married late, slept lightly, chose homes with simple layouts and many windows. I avoided basements, never lived above my workplace again. Some habits never leave you. People sometimes ask why I never wrote my story down sooner. The answer is simple. Survival teaches you silence. But silence has a cost. It lets myths grow. It lets monsters become legends instead of warnings. Holmes wasn't a genius. He was methodical. He didn't kill in fits of rage. He built systems. He exploited trust. He understood how cities lose track of people. And that understanding, more than the murders themselves, was the real danger. I speak now because survival isn't just living past something. It's making sure it doesn't happen again. When people walk past that street today, they see nothing remarkable. But I see what once stood there, a place designed to make disappearance easy. And I remember how close I came to becoming another missing name. I wasn't stronger than his victims. I was luckier. That truth humbles me every day.
Years have passed since that spring in Chicago when I first met Holmes. Decades, really, though the memory remains as vivid as the gas lamps flickering in the murder castle's twisted hallways. I have lived long enough to see the city rebuilt, the streets renamed, the skyline rise higher and higher. And yet, no matter how far I travel, the lessons remain. Survival is not about strength. It is not about luck. It is not even about running fast or hiding well. Survival is attention, observation, adaptation. Holmes taught me this, whether he meant to or not. He designed a machine to erase lives, and in doing so, he showed me what it means to navigate the world without being consumed by it. I have carried that lesson in every choice since. I married late, as I mentioned. I had children who never knew the story in full, only pieces, warnings embedded in ordinary advice. Never trust a smile that feels too perfect. Never enter a place that feels wrong. Never ignore the weight of instinct. I lived cautiously, but I also lived fully. Each day outside the shadow of the murder castle became a quiet triumph. I have visited the city occasionally, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself that monsters can hide in plain sight, that the world will often look ordinary even when horror lurks beneath the surface. And Chicago, for all its growth and grandeur, still holds those streets where ambition, greed, and evil once converged. I walk them with awareness, not fear. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, I dream of the building, hallways twisting impossibly, doors that shouldn't exist, the faint hiss of gas, the metallic scent of hidden kilns, and shadows that wait behind every corner. But I wake, and I remember that the shadows cannot reach me here. I survived because I watched, because I learned, and because I refused to become a ghost in someone else's design. I often wonder about the women who never checked out, the lives lost, the stories untold. I honor them in memory, in silence, and in sharing this truth with the world. Their existence was stolen, but their story and the warning it carries cannot be. Holmes's legacy is paradoxical. He was a monster, yes, but also a teacher, however unwilling. He demonstrated the power of observation, planning, and manipulation in a way no textbook ever could. I survived him, and in surviving, I became the living testimony that attention, vigilance, and courage, even when paired with fear, can outlast the most meticulously crafted evil. History remembers him for the horror he inflicted, and yet history can also remember survival, the resilience of those who refuse to vanish. So I tell this story not to glorify him, but to remind us all, evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and survival is earned one careful step at a time. And while buildings can be engineered to trap, and men can be calculated in cruelty, the human will, the desire to live, is far more intricate, far more enduring than even the most ingenious monster. Chicago rebuilt, streets renamed, the castle gone, yet the lesson remains. Survival is not a single act, it is a lifetime. And sometimes it is the quiet courage of those who lived to tell the story that becomes the truest measure of all. I survived, and in surviving, I bear witness.